All right, this is episode 2 of the Bat, Fox, and Flux Tavern. Today we'll be speaking on the 3.5 core book classes from the Players Handbook. Before we start, I'd just like to reiterate, because I was told by some fans last week that we weren't very clear on whether or not we were going to be going into mechanics. Generally speaking, no. If we go into the mechanics, it'll just be very briefly to explain a point that requires a basic understanding of how the mechanic works to understand why something is the way it is. Outside of situations like that, we're going to mostly stick to mostly the fluff, the roleplay value, and just sort of generalized, almost character creation stuff. The kind of stuff you think of when you're making your character, because that's never the mechanics you're thinking of when you make a character. It's always the theme, what it generally does, and so on. Which is why we're talking about classes this week after doing alignments. We're going to be doing these in the order that the book gives them in, which is alphabetical order, which starts us off at the Barbarian. The Barbarian is, according to the book, I'm just going to read from the book here for a moment. From the frozen wastes of the north and the hellish jungles of the south come brave, even reckless warriors. Civilized people call them barbarians or berserkers and suspect them of mayhem, impiety, and atrocities. These barbarians, however, have proven their mettle and their value to those who would be their allies. To enemies who underestimate them, they have proved their cunning, resourcefulness, persistence, and mercilessness. If only that were true. Barbarians are glass cannons, and they're also the first of what we will be referring to in the future as the troll classes. Not because they're used by trolls, but because they troll you. They look amazing on paper. In practice, they leave a lot to be desired, even though on paper they seem like they should be amazing. The very core function of the Barbarian, in my opinion, is his own downfall. He's designed to be a unarmored or lightly armored, frontline, nimble fighter that does a lot of damage. The problem, he wears almost little to no armor, and he's not all that nimble. So he tends to take a lot of damage and die, and the core mechanic behind the Barbarian's supposed survivability and ability to kill fast, which is his rage, just makes him more squishy, because even though it gives him more health, it lowers his defense. And then when it runs out, he's borderline useless for like hours. So
yeah, the rage is a double-edged sword, which is definitely a problem.
it definitely
But
is.
Thankfully, though, there is some misconceptions about rage. Going into a rage is not a blind rage. That's a totally different class that people keep on getting mixed up. Rage, it raises your constitution and your strength, drops your, dex?
Your armor class. Your straight armor class takes a -2, but you also get a bonus to your will saves because you're so angry that mind-affecting things are harder to use on you.
Yeah, and you can't use any concentration-based abilities, any kind of skills that require you to think. It's annoying.
Granted, you're a barbarian. Annoying. You're not going to be using concentration things anyways, so.
No.
Sure enough, and you're also illiterate as fuck, so.
Yeah, and the other downside to your rage is the fact that it is very, very short at low levels, and you can only do it once or twice at low levels because it's based on your constitution modifier. Fit of Rage lasts for number of rounds equals to 3 plus the character's newly improved constitution modifier. That sounds amazing until you realize that at low level, your newly improved constitution modifier is like 2. Or if you're smart and you made constitution like your highest stat, you might be looking at 6 turns of rage, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not.
Yeah, the only problem with that, though, is the real key ability for barbarians is strength, because that's what a lot of their skills are based on.
Strength helps you hit, and it helps you do more damage. So without strength being your primary focus and constitution being your primary focus, the cannon part of your glass cannon character has been weakened. On the other hand, if you don't focus constitution, you're emphasizing the glass side of it. So you're stuck in this catch-22, where you have to choose between more strength to offset the weakness, or offsetting the weakness at the cost of strength.
To be fair, though, it's not the weakest of the class in terms of hit points, though. It actually has the most hit points of any class.
It is the only class I am aware of, at least the only class in the core book, that has 12 hit points per level that you roll. You roll 1d12, and if you roll a 12, congratulations, you have 12 new hit points plus your constitution modifier. And they're also kind of weak on skills. They don't get a lot of skills, but they also don't get a lot of skill points either. They only get 4 skill points plus their intelligence modifier, and if you're smart, that's your dump stat. A barbarian has no need of intelligence whatsoever. In fact, they start off illiterate. Every barbarian is illiterate. unless you spend 2 skill points to get the ability to read and write languages that you already speak.
Yeah, because that's gonna happen. No,
Now-
no one's gonna do that.
Now, to offset this, and this is where I'm kind of the devil's advocate for Barbarian, illiteracy goes away immediately if you multiclass, and a Barbarian should multiclass. I think a good Barbarian only stays in it long enough to get whatever class ability that they're really, really jonesing for. Ideally, it's one of the Uncanny Dodges, because Uncanny Dodge is a great ability to have, especially in a campaign where your Dungeon Master likes to throw traps at you. Uncanny Dodge is great for that. Plus, Barbarian gets Trap Sense, which helps them be sort of a secondary rogue, which is really what I think they tried to do. I think they tried to meld the rogue and the fighter when they made the Barbarian, and they kind of failed at both. But giving the rage
Yeah.
to a different class, like multiclassing from Barbarian into a Druid, can be terrifying. You can be turned into an animal, which is an ability we'll get into when we get to the Druid, and then you can go into a rage, and next thing you know, you're a giant rampaging bear. This is a terrifying thing. And because you only should take a few levels in Barbarian, yes, you can only do that once or twice a day. But that once or twice a day is sort of your ace in the hole, whereas for the Barbarian, that once or twice a day is when you're useful. And that's my little devil's advocate on the Barbarian. They're a great starting class for someone who wants to multi-class into a nature-themed character, or if they want to start a Barbarian and then jump into Fighter. Because Fighter will help offset a lot of the inherent weakness of the Barbarian, and a Fighter having access to 1 or 2 rages a day with Uncanny Dodge on top of it all can be a very formidable fighter if you're building a mobility fighter who doesn't wear a lot of armor and relies on staying mobile in the fight to do his job.
The only downside is if you end up going lawful, you do lose your rage.
You lose your
You-
rage,
you
and
have
I
to-
think you lose some of your other abilities too.
No, you keep all of your abilities except for rage.
Okay, except for the rage, which again, that's your key class-defining ability. Without the rage, the Barbarian is just a really shitty fighter.
Yep. You have to be non-lawful to get into the class, and it's primarily thought of to be a frontline combat specialist, but it really doesn't work out
It's
that
not.
way
In
in
fact,
practice.
it's a skirmisher. If you're going to play a straight Barbarian, and props to you if you do. I have played a straight Barbarian. I found it fun, but it is very difficult because of the inherent weaknesses. You want to play a skirmisher. You want to play someone who jumps into the fight for 1 hit and then jumps away to safety. You want to play smarter, not harder. And too many people just pick a chaotic, lug-headed, dunderhead character who just blindly marches into battle and hopes his rage keeps him alive until the other guy dies. That's not how you should play a Barbarian. It's how you think you should play a Barbarian. It's how everything that has ever existed that shows Barbarians in popular media and culture tells you should play a Barbarian, but that's not how you should play a Barbarian. He is a skirmisher through and through. In fact, a key feature of that is his ability, Fast Movement. If he's wearing light armor or no armor, and he's carrying only a light load, he has an extra 10 feet of speed because he's fast. And people overlook that. That's very key to the Barbarian. The Barbarian is built to be fast. He is speedy. He's not supposed to sit there and take the hits. He's a glass cannon. And unfortunately, Wizards kind of forgot that almost immediately after making Fast Movement and tried to make him look like he should be a tank. He's not. It's a fighter. We'll get into that later.
I'm going to interject here. Fast movement you can wear with medium armor, so a Barbarian can wear medium armor, and only difference is he'll stay at about 30 and not get the penalty from medium, I believe.
Yeah, it'll offset the
So-
penalty of most medium, of most heavier medium
So
armors.
your Barbarian won't always be unarmored. They can actually put on decent amounts of armor. They just can't go into the heavy plate armor that's reserved for pretty much fighters or paladins.
God
Which,
damn it! I wrote my
works.
notes bad. I wrote 20 feet instead of 30 feet.
Well, it does say medium armor reduces your speed to 20.
Only if you're halfling.
Yeah, a halfling barbarian has a speed of 20.
Which is honestly hilarious because the book also says that barbarians are mostly human, half orc, and rarely dwarves, but all other races are extremely rare.
Yes, in fact, dwarfs is good because dwarves are naturally slower than the other races anyway. If I recall, dwarves take a speed penalty for some bizarre reason.
dwarves are considered medium-sized. They take a penalty of 10 because they aren't affected by armor weight restrictions. They don't get slowed down, which, granted, a barbarian already offsets that, so a dwarf barbarian doesn't really
A
work
dwarf
that well.
barbarian is actually a kind of scary concept because it does mess with people. Dwarves, you expect them to be wearing as much heavy shit as possible because that's what you do with a dwarf, because they just ignore heavy shit. They move at the same speed no matter what. What you don't expect is that dwarf to come barreling at you at 30 feet around. It's not the best way to use a dwarf, but it's a good sort of surprise thing to do. It can really off-balance people. See, another good feature of the Barbarian, as I mentioned earlier, was Uncanny Dodge, which is the ability to react to danger before he senses normally allow him to do so, which means he retains his dexterity bonus to armor class, even if flat-footed, or struck by an invisible attacker. That's incredibly useful for a frontline fighter to have. That's an ability I think is only shared by, I believe, monks and rogues.
I believe so, yeah.
I believe so, and that is incredibly useful. And I believe improved Uncanny Dodge makes you immune to flanking, which they also get. The rogue cannot sneak attack the Barbarian by flanking him, unless they have at least 4 more rogue levels than he has Barbarian levels, which is very, very useful because flanking is something that every player and every GM should be trying to make their people do. Flanking gives lots of bonuses that are amazing. And the ability
we'll get
to say,
later,
fuck you, flanking, yeah.
As we'll get to later, rogues' lives depend on flanking.
Yeah. And the ability to say fuck you to someone who tries to flank you is a strong, strong thing to have on a frontline fighter, which is why I'm a proponent of multi-classing your barbarians. I believe you have to be wearing light armor for Uncanny Dodge to work? No. Uncanny Dodge itself does not say that you require to wear light armor. So while you do take penalties while wearing heavy armor because of the barbarian side of your class, you do retain the Uncanny Dodge if you decide to go to heavier armors as a barbarian fighter. Again, which is a dangerous mix to do, and not a lot of people think to try that. See, damage reduction. Barbarians have natural damage reduction. It starts at, I believe, a damage reduction of 1 at 7th level. At 10th level and every 3 levels thereafter, it goes up by another 1 point. And that allows them to ignore damage. So much damage that they take is ignored unless it exceeds that amount. And then only the amount that's exceeded by is done. So say he has a damage reduction of 3 and someone does 5 damage to him, he's only taking 2 damage.
Or if he gets hit for 2 damage, he just shrugs it off like, what was that? Did a mosquito bite me?
Exactly. That seems amazing, but again, that's one of the things that makes it kind of a trap class. It looks amazing on paper. I believe by the end of it, he does have a damage reduction of 4. But a damage reduction of 4 at the levels we're talking about, I mean, by then you're, what, 19th level? Yeah. Damage reduction of 4 at 19th level is not all that amazing.
5.
Is it a damage reduction of 5?
Yes.
Oh, yes, I forgot to count 10th level. So damage reduction of 5 sounds great. You still need armor at that level. 5 is only doing so much. You still don't want to get hit. Damage reduction of 5 just makes that hit hurt slightly less. You're still getting hit for a lot of damage, though. At that point, you're running into things that can do routinely 30 to 40 damage a hit. So you're still looking at 25 to 35 damage at the end of the day. Greater Rage is what they get at 11th level, which just makes their rages even stronger. Eventually, they get Mighty Rage at 20th level, which is the penultimate bonus to their abilities through their rage. The one thing a Barbarian benefits from, and this is the only reason you stay a pure Barbarian, if for whatever reason you enjoy raging and you have stayed alive long enough, you earn Tireless Rage. Tireless Rage is you stop being useless after you're done raging. Because normally you get fatigued.
Which is some negatives to your stats until you can get a rest. With a -2 penalty to your strength score, a -2 penalty to your dex score, and you can't charge a run, which can be a pain in the butt.
Right. It can be offset by a cleric.
It can be offset by a cleric, but that assumes you have a cleric in the party, and granted, every good party has a cleric, but as Flux and I both know from recent experience, not every party has a cleric.
No, sometimes they rely on a druid, which is not a good idea.
Isn't a bad alternative to a cleric, but you don't want to rely on a druid anyway. Unless you have 2 secondary healers, you don't want to rely on secondary healers. One secondary healer can never do the job as well as a cleric. The only other thing that barbarians get, really, as a feature to them, is the ability called Indomitable Will, which is at 14th level and higher, they get +4 to their will saves to resist enchantment spells. And that's really meant to be more the fact that barbarians are designed to be very strong-willed creatures. They have very strong beliefs and feelings, and it's very hard to enchant them away from those beliefs and feelings. And that's, obviously, in that ability, is personified there, but you get it so late, it's not all that great an ability.
One thing to take note with barbarians is, how does it work in a party of other people? Well,
exactly.
Most barbarians are comfortable with rangers, druids, and clerics that revere nature deities. Many do admire bards for their musical talent and their ability. They don't trust wizards because they don't believe in their book magic because they don't understand it. They're a little bit more understanding of sorcerers, but only slightly, mainly because sorcerers tend to be extremely charismatic. Monks don't sometimes see eye to eye with barbarians, but it doesn't generally mean they're going to be hostile to each other.
No.
And they don't really have any strong feelings one way or another with fighters, paladins, clerics of other deities, and rogues.
Now, granted, that's general guidelines. That's generally what the default sort of barbarian mindset that the book presents you is. You're more than welcome to have your barbarian have his own opinions of other classes.
But that's the norm that
That's the
that
norm.
the system has portrayed.
There is sort of a core setting that is accepted as existing as per described by the book. And it's not really, I think in 3.5 it's actually a specific setting.
Yeah, Greyhawk.
Greyhawk, yeah. Greyhawk is accepted as anything that how it works in the Greyhawk books, the Greyhawk supplements, and so on, is how the mechanics assume everything works and how the rules assume everything works. You're free to tweak as necessary and as desired, but you should always check with your DM, because your DM may in fact be using Greyhawk, or you may be using something else. There are plenty of pre-designed campaign settings that Wizards has made over the years, or he may be doing something completely on his own that he just made up.
Which is more often the case.
I've wanted to and have run everything from very low magic campaigns to very high magic campaigns, where the streets are lit by globes of magic and magic carpets are like taxis. There's all sorts of campaign settings, and obviously you want to tailor your character's beliefs to the setting. I mean, if you have a high magic campaign, having a barbarian who completely distrusts and wants nothing to do with magic could be a problem, or it could be a fun little character hang-up. It depends on how the party feels, how you feel, and how your game master feels. More or less, I think we kind of exhausted the Barbarian there.
I think so.
So that brings us to Bard.
Ah, crap.
Bard is designed from the ground up to be the jack of all trades. The Bard is the class that fits the gap. If there's a hole somewhere in your party for whatever reason, be it one character's out of commission, or someone didn't show up to the fucking character creation session, and you didn't know what they were going to play, someone usually makes a Bard. That is what
Fucking
the Bard
bards.
does. Bards are very interesting in that there's only two ways to have a bard work. They don't or they do. They don't if you don't know how to break a bard. If you know how to break a bard, they're amazing. The problem is they're broken if you break them. And that can be very, very unfair to the rest of the party if they themselves have not broken their characters.
Or haven't figured out how to yet.
How to? Because every
seems to be my problem.
Every character can be broken in some way, shape, or form, be it through careful multi-classing, careful selection of feats, and so on and so on. Bards can do a little bit of everything. They can be in the front line, but they're not great at it. They can be in a secondary line with a ranged weapon, but they're not great at it. They can do magic, but they're not great at it. They have a lot of skills that they can pick from, but not the most skill points that anyone can get. They have a decent amount of skill points, don't get me wrong, but they don't have the most skill points. That'd be rogues that we'll get to later. They're very, very well-rounded, and on paper, they seem like there's no way they can fail. In practice, there's plenty of ways they can fail because they're a jack of all trades. They rely on being good at a little bit of everything. If you can't be good at a little bit of everything, then your bard is usually doomed to failure if you can't quickly find a way to somehow specialize in something, which takes away from the whole point of the bard. Good focused uses for the bards. Bards are primarily a support class. Their abilities focus mainly on helping the party through buffs, and his magic is also very support based. It's also very making the party or himself better, or just generally messing with your enemies, be it by slowing them down, stunning them, charming them, just using his magic, his wits, his guile, and his magic to mislead, misdirect, and generally make their day a bad day. I think I'll turn it over to Red Fox, because Red Fox knows how to break bards.
No, I don't. Just said I don't.
I thought you did.
Just said I don't.
I thought you did before we started, and I wasn't sure what you said just there. All right, then we'll just go into... Ignore me! We'll just go into Bard's abilities. The first real thing about Bards is obviously their spells. They start off with special Bard spells, which I think for the most part are particular just to them. They share a couple spells, I think, with wizards and sorcerers, but most bardic magic is unique to bards. And it's almost always something that invokes a will save. It's something that messes with your head, tries to mislead you with illusions. They're very tricky. is sort of the underlying theme of the bard. They like to be very tricky and use all these sort of tricks and things to just mess with you. Bards also get an ability called Bardic Knowledge, which just lets them know knowledge randomly. They get to do a roll, and if they make the roll, they just know something because they're a bard, and they just collect stories and tales. So they have this big backlog of esoteric knowledge that they just carry around in their head. Bardic Music is the other ability, which is what I was talking about earlier when I said that bards have abilities that buffs. They get things such as Countersong, which is essentially, I believe, the bardic equivalent of counterspells. Using a perform check, you can let someone do a saving throw. Do a saving throw or alter the saving throw? I'm trying to skim this right now because I didn't. Bardic Music was such a long thing, it's hard to figure out where to skim in here. To give you an idea how big, I think Bardic Music's like almost a page and a quarter.
Granted, Bardic Music also covers like 12 different abilities.
Yeah, there's like 12 different abilities that are Bardic Music, because that's what bards do. They play music, they sing songs, they recite epic poems, they play music. Bardic Music takes various forms, but the underlying thing being that bards do music, and their music has a magic unto itself. This magic has various effects on the party that makes them better, helps them shrug off debilitating effects, or helps them resist enemy magic. Actually, looking at all the Bardic music, I really don't want to get too deep into Bardic music. We could spend all day on Bardic music, honestly. As core as Bardic music is to bards, there's so much stuff in there. Like suggestion, they can suggest things to people with weak wills. Inspire greatness, they just make everyone else around them feel better in the form of temporary hit dice. Song of Freedom, which just breaks enchantments. They have various effects that essentially wizards and sorcerers do a magic, but the bard can just do it at will, because music works that way. There's really not much else you could say about the bard.
There's a few things.
Well, feel free to enlighten our viewers.
You really can't be lawful being a bard. It just doesn't work because they're too free-spirited. And if you become lawful, you cannot progress in bard, but you still do keep all your bard abilities, which is nice. Unlike Barbarian, you lose rage, but with bard, you keep your magic, you keep your songs, you keep everything, which is nice. The races are actually kind of hilarious. Half-orcs find themselves to be ill-suited to being bards. And there are no bardic traditions in the dwarf and halfling settlements, but occasional individuals have become bards. They're more commonly human, gnome, elf, and half-elf, though. They get along with everybody. Bards are like the everybody loves me kind of class.
And often nobody does, because bards are either broken, so everyone's just being angry at them for being broken, or the guy playing the bard does not break his bard, in which case he's just a detriment to the party and everyone's just screaming at him to keep up.
Yeah, in practice, no one likes bards.
No one likes bards, which is really why I didn't want to spend too much time on bards. I have no real good things to say on bards, but I could go on day on the negative things to say about bards, but we're not here to go all day about the negative things to say about bards. So without further ado, Flux, would you like to tell us about clerics?
Not really much to say. Clerics are the healers of a group. Nah. If you imagine a cleric, you would usually think of like a healer, which clerics do in D&D, but clerics in D&D are usually also very well armored. Clerics are usually come into battle wearing decent armor and just sit there and heal up people who are nearby them. They can turn undead, they can enforce their teammates, they can make sure everyone else is doing good, and bring up holy powers. They're one of the spellcasting classes, but actually one of the few spellcasting classes that doesn't get hurt that much if they get punched. They can cast the spells of their god, but the big problem with a cleric is they have to choose a god.
No, they don't.
They don't.
3.5 did something I think is great with clerics. They don't need to pick a god.
You can pick an aspect if you don't want to pick a deity.
Yeah, you can pick one of the divine portfolios that are presented in the magic chapter, and we'll get into magic another week more in depth. You can pick one of the divine portfolios from that chapter and pick a secondary one. Those two portfolios will shape your belief system, and you can, instead of drawing power directly from a god, you draw divine might directly from your convictions and beliefs in an ideal or in a philosophy or in some other thing. It brings up the idea that religion is more than just worshiping a god, that religion can also be worshiping a certain set of beliefs and values and on how the world works.
But a cleric has to believe something. You can't be a cleric who doesn't believe in something. It doesn't really work that way.
You cannot be a cleric that doesn't believe it. You have to have a belief system from which you draw strength, and that belief system generally speaking, should be integral to your mechanics. It should be integral to your concept. The whole fluff of a cleric should usually revolve around his convictions and his beliefs. When you make your background and when you make sort of how your cleric acts, you should think first and foremost, what does my cleric believe in, and how does that shape who he is?
But one of the big things with clerics is, unlike other classes whose belief systems are fluff to them, clerics, what you believe in is going to change how you play the game.
Yeah.
If you believe in a god of war, you're going to have completely different spells from a cleric who believes in a god of law or a god of magic. Depending on what you believe in is going to change completely how a cleric plays and what spells they get and what they do.
Yeah, it seems like a minor change in the grand scheme of things because there is a massive list of spells that is common to all clerics. But there's what are called domain spells because each god has several domains of which they have power over. And your god that you pick or your belief system that you pick, if you choose just to jump the middleman of a god and go straight to a particular two sets of belief systems, will define what you do because every belief system at every spell level has a spell that it gives you as a extra slot. You can prepare one of your domain spells, and you have two domains, so you get access to two domain spells at every given spell level. You get to pick one of those two of each level from one of your two domains as a bonus spell each day, as well as getting usually a daily ability from each domain, where each domain gives you an ability that once a day you can just do this one thing because your domain empowers you with the ability to do it. For example, the strength domain, which I know off the top of my head, once a day you can just give yourself a bonus to strength equal to your cleric level in the form of a massive divine smiting of your foe. Or like the destruction domain, you get the smite power that paladins use, where you do a +4 bonus on your attack roll and the damage roll gets a bonus equal to your cleric level. These are little small things that seem small, but are actually very big in how they fundamentally change your cleric, because they will give you access to certain spells that aren't on the shared list. They're usually taken from wizards or druids, I believe, depending on the domain. I know the nature domain, I believe, takes heavily from the druid spell list.
Somewhat.
That's just one of the things about a cleric. You have to have that be a core part of your character because it's a core part of your mechanics. It is your mechanic. Also, as Flux said, you are not just the healer who sits in the back. Clerics are just as good a front line, if not sometimes better, than your fighter. That cleric should be right next to your fighter, or if your cleric doesn't really wear heavy armors for whatever reason, he should be right behind him offering support and ready to heal him at a moment's notice. That's the cleric's ideal position, is either next to or directly behind the fighter. He's right up there in the thick of things. Because that's what he does. He wades in the battle, and he's trading blow for blow right up there next to your frontliners. And
Completely invalidates another class, but we'll get to that later.
we'll get to that very soon, and Flux will have a lot to say about that class. Turning undead, I believe, is the act of destroying undead.
No. You can turn undead scares them away. Eventually, a cleric learns rebuke undead, which destroys undead.
No,
Okay,
no,
sorry.
no.
Wait.
Turning is destroying, rebuking is commanding them. And this is how it works. A good cleric turns undead, which destroys them. An evil cleric rebukes undead. It makes them either cower in fear of his greatness, or makes them bend to his will and do as he commands. An interesting distinction that it makes, and this goes into your deity choice if you choose to be a cleric that worships the deity. The cleric and the deity do not need to match alignment. They can be one off from each other, be it either on lawful and chaotic scale or the good and evil scale, which allows a neutral cleric who worships an evil deity to rebuke undead, but he himself is not evil. You may wonder, how can this be possible? Shouldn't worshipping an evil god be an evil act? Depends on the evil god. Because there is one god in particular I can think of as a prime example of how you can get away with a neutral cleric in a party who does not go around doing evil things, and that's Neril. And we'll get more into this. We're going to do an episode on deities later, so we'll get more into deities. But just in general, Neril, for those who don't know, is the neutral evil god of death. He is essentially the Grim Reaper in god form. A cleric who worships him could very well be neutral and only focus on the natural order of life and death as sort of why he follows Neril and get away with getting rebuke undead. Likewise, a neutral cleric who follows a good god gets turned undead. brings up this interesting thing where if you're a neutral cleric, depending on what god you pick, you kind of get to pick or choose whether you turn a rebuke undead. Whereas if you're a good cleric or an evil cleric, regardless of what god you follow, regardless of whether or not you even follow gods, you do one or the other. And I thought that was just an interesting little bit of forethought they did, where they decided to give neutral clerics that choice. What do they choose to do with their power? Because they're neutral. Another thing about clerics that's very integral to them is the idea of spontaneous casting, and this is what makes them great healers. They can just get rid of a spell because they have to prepare their spells in advance. There's a limit to how many spells of each level per day they can prepare. If they find that they need more healing spells, they can dump a spell and instantly gain and cast an equivalent cure spell of the same level or lower, which is what makes them great healers, because they can just say, I've run out of cure spells. Time to go make more. And I think... There we are, aura. That's another thing I forgot to get into. Clerics have an aura about them. That's chaotic, evil, good, or lawful. And it's basically the aura of their deity's alignment. If they worship a lawful good god and they are themselves lawful good, their aura registers as lawful good. This works no matter what your actual alignment is. If you're neutral and you worship a chaotic neutral god, for whatever reason the game decides that if someone tries to read your aura, they think you're chaotic neutral. Because the fact that you're channeling your god's power means that you're giving off a chaotic aura even though you're not chaotic. Which, going back to our previous example of a neutral follower of Nerul, you'd be a neutral person who gives off an evil aura. Because the game rules decide that that's how auras work for the purpose of clerics. That's really it for mechanics, other than spells, is that you can't cast spells of an alignment opposed to your own or his deity, so you can't be a good cleric that casts evil spells. You can't be lawful and cast chaotic spells. I think we should turn over to Red Fox now, who seems to like going over the classes and things like that when it comes to their races and things. So Red Fox, if you'd like to do that, a little bit of cleric.
If a cleric violates an alignment shift that goes against one of the gods, they do lose quite a bit of stuff. They lose all their spells and class features, except for armor and shield proficiencies and proficiencies with simple weapons. It's really, really gnarly if you go against your deity's alignment.
Yeah, they don't like that.
Yeah, this is one of the most heavy hit problems of all the classes. Going against your deity's alignment is very, very bad. You don't want to do it.
Which brings it interesting with my previous example of how a neutral cleric who follows an evil god can use Rebuke Undead. This brings up the interesting point of a neutral cleric toes a very, very, very thin line if he follows an evil god, because being too good is against his god's alignment and will result in his god shutting him off. So he really has to stay in the neutral if he wants to avoid pissing off his god too much.
Yeah, in terms of racial diversity, every race has clerics. There's no exception. There's a need for religion in every race.
Every race has a god they worship, even if they themselves don't have a racial god.
Yeah.
Which for the longest time humans didn't for some bizarre reason. And wizards finally decided to give them a god, and it was a dick.
In a party of other classes, the cleric pretty much gets along with everyone. At least everyone gets along with the cleric anyway.
Because he's the healer, and you don't want to piss off the healer, or you'll find yourself bleeding to death. You'll find yourself bleeding to death, and the healer will just be like, I don't see you right over there. I'm going to go heal this other guy.
Sometimes clash with other druids, but it's...
Other druids?
Well, yeah. Druids, their nature, not so much gods. And they represent an older way of doing things, and they do clash on the aspect of mortal versus the divine. And it can be a bit of an annoyance, but not really a detriment. I mean,
surprisingly
you can get along.
I find it's usually the druid who takes issue with the cleric, especially when the cleric gets into the habit of raising dead party members when they get powerful enough to do that. Because druids, since they're usually very nature-oriented, aren't really big on disrupting the order of life and death. Druids do have the ability to bring back the dead, but only through reincarnation. Which we'll get into. So, non-reincarnation forms of reanimation sometimes can grate on a druid's nerves. They may not hate a cleric for it, but they may make snide, angry comments at them for sort of disrupting the natural flow of things.
Depending on your cleric's point of view, you may or not get along with the likes of a rogue. It's touch and go sometimes. If you worship the god of thieves, you're going to love
you're going to get along.
Thieves.
Yeah, if you worship the god of thieves, you're getting along great with rogues. They're going to be drinking together and having a grand old time.
If you're going with the God of Valor, well, you're not going to be liking the Thief so much.
No.
And one thing the clerics usually don't like is clerics of other alignments. Clerics would very much dislike clerics of other alignments.
Do not get along very well. They may work together, they may respect each other, but at the end of the day, they're going to disagree on a fundamental level, especially when their gods differ, and especially when their gods do not get along themselves. Clerics of Garl Glurgold probably get this more often than any other cleric, because Garl Glurgold is the fucking troll of gods. And he just goes around fucking with other gods, because he can. I imagine his clerics are not very well liked by other clerics.
Or if you have a cleric of Hextor and a cleric of Heronius, they can't be in a room for more than 2 seconds without attacking each other.
Right. In fact, even I think clerics of Elidum, the god of rogues, would run that problem, because I do believe the god of rogues has a habit of stealing from the other gods just because he can. I do recall somewhere reading that Elidamara just sometimes steals from the other gods and then hides things in the material planes because he can, and then he leaves it there for his followers and his rogues to find.
But that's getting into deities, and that's not what this subject's on.
That's not what this is about. So we're going to cut that short, and we're going to move into druids.
Yay, one of my favorite classes.
Why, it's your topic.
Druids are the hippies of the bunch, honestly. They revere nature. They sometimes follow deities of nature, but they don't have to. They can. It's nice to be a druid. You get to use magic, druid magic, and your druid spells have generally aspects of either plant life or animal. Fox's cunning, bear's strength, things like that. You can also just turn into an animal once a day, and you can get more of it later on, which is fun. Turn into a bear and maul people. That's an excellent way of doing things. You cannot be just any old alignment, though. Druids actually are very specific on the alignments of neutral good, lawful neutral, neutral, chaotic neutral, or neutral evil. You have
or
to
just
be
straight
neutral
neutral.
Something. Yeah, you have to be neutral. Neutral something. That's the problem with druids, is they don't give a shit about too much. They want to stay in the middle of roads of things.
They care little for good and evil because nature has no use for good or evil.
Except you do have to choose a spectrum of one alignment of neutral. You'd be at lawful chaotic scale or good and evil scale.
Most druids I've encountered go under the assumption that good and evil can be taken or left and tend to go along the lawful the chaotic scale, but it is possible that they may decide that law and chaos is irrelevant in the grand scale of nature and that it's good or evil that is preferred. And some may just decide fuck all of it and just be neutral.
Yeah, nature is indifferent to those around them. They just are. They do get an animal companion, which is nice. They can choose from various woodland animals, most commonly a wolf, though.
And they also get nature sense and wild empathy, which helps them deal with being in nature. It gives them bonuses to nature-based skills and the ability to handle animals. Wild empathy basically gives them a bonus to interacting with animals, whereas nature sense helps them with things like survival and things like that.
The animal companion is not more intelligent than a normal animal. They just learn stuff. They'll get natural bonuses to their armor, natural bonuses to their hit dice, some strength and dex bonuses, and be able to learn extra tricks, which are things you can teach your animal. They do get a few special things like the ability to share spells, but like I said, no improved intelligence. That's another type of animal companion, which comes down further along with the sorcerer.
Well, familiar, not an animal companion, but yeah. There's a distinction that is made to help differentiate the two.
Yep.
Because there are many, many core mechanic differences between how an animal companion works and how a familiar works.
Yeah, at 9th level, you do gain the ability to be immune to venom. At 13th level, you can change your appearance at will in your natural form, so you can make your face look different constantly. At 15th level, you no longer age. You will become ageless with nature.
You'll still eventually die when your time comes, but until that time, you will stay the age at which you achieve that level naturally until the day you die.
Yeah. You can become an ex-druid and lose your druid stuff. If you cease to revere nature, your alignment changes to not be neutral something, or you teach the secret language of the druids to a non-druid, you lose all your spells and druid abilities, including your animal companion, but you still keep your proficiencies. You cannot gain levels in it again until you atone for your transgression, just like a cleric. it's kind of a pain.
It's actually a really big pain, especially if you're not anywhere near any druids to atone with.
Yeah, and
Which also
druids are
makes you
very
wonder,
rare.
if you're not near any druids, how do they know that you transgressed and magically took away your powers? Because druids,
Really
because
is.
as
How
Flux said,
do
your
you do
god
that?
knows. Druids don't follow a god, though.
Not nature itself knows.
Yeah,
I guess you could argue.
nature
I guess
itself
you could
knows.
argue nature itself knows, but
Nature is a living thing in D&D, and if you piss it off, it is going to take away what it's giving.
that's true. In 3.5, it's not made as clear as it is in 4th edition, which we'll get into sometime down the road, some other episode probably. In 3.5, it's not made very clear, but it's true that nature itself is alive and sentient, which makes it really interesting that gods can affect nature as a domain
It's one of
when
those
nature
weird
itself
things.
is alive. Yeah, it's very strange how that whole interaction works. Thankfully, in 4e, they kind of better defined where nature cuts off and gods begin.
The druid also does gain the spontaneous casting that the cleric does.
Which allows them
instead
to,
of a healing spell, though, they gain a spell of summoning an ally of nature, which is nice. You get to summon animals to your aid.
But that does mean that even though you do get access to healing spells as a druid, you don't have the ability to sacrifice an existing spell for a healing spell if you run out, which means that you have to pre-plan to heal somebody, and that cuts into how many spells you've prepared per day. Druids don't get a lot of spells per day. At most, they get 6 spells per day for the lowest level spells, 5 per day for many of the lower tier spells, and then for the highest tier spells, they only really get 4 per day, and the only way to get more of those, really, is through having a high, I believe it's a high wisdom for them. Whatever your spellcasting, whatever your key spellcasting stat for a spellcasting class is, there is a table at the beginning of the book that says, if your stat is this high, you get this many bonus spells of these spell levels. I believe it's equal to the modifiers. Like if you have a +3, you get bonus level 1, 2, and 3 spells. And that is one of the things that makes the druid not desirable as a primary healer. Because the druid, at that point, if the druid has to be your healer, they are pretty much relegated to heal bitch. Because they have to do nothing but prepare heal spells. They can't prepare their other spells, which are very, very useful in combat and crowd control. They have the ability to ensnare large groups of enemies with grasping roots, to launch spells that damage wide areas. They're very good at corralling enemies or just wiping them out on a mass scale. And they have a few spells that are very good for taking out single large targets that have a lot of health by just pummeling them with lightning and fire and various other elements. Because that's a key thing of their spells, is their spells are essentially them calling upon the elements and directing their wrath against their foes. If you're constantly picking heal spells every day, you're not doing that. And that can make playing a druid not very fun if you're constantly having to prepare heal spells, which is why it's my philosophy, every party needs a cleric.
Yep.
Or, in lieu of a cleric, you need 2 secondary healers so that they could split the prepared heal spells between the 2 of them. Because having only 1 secondary healer in charge of preparing heal spells does not for a fun game experience make for anybody, because they're also going to run out of spells way more often. Druids, like clerics, they cannot cast spells of an opposite alignment. A neutral good cleric cannot cast an evil spell. A lawful neutral cleric cannot cast a chaotic spell, because they are restricted from casting spells against their alignment, because the spells themselves are infused with an alignment if the spell has an alignment. It is harmful to you to be hit or come in contact usually with a spell of a different alignment. If not harmful in actual damage, it's harmful usually in fluff, where it'll singe and burn and feel very uncomfortable to be in contact with a spell of an opposite alignment, if you draw power from a divine source or from nature.
Mainly it equates to you can't cast that spell, or the rod is infused with so much evil as you pick it up, you flinch and drop it onto the floor.
Yeah, it tries to backlash at you and say, put me down, I'm not for you, kind of a thing. I don't think arcane casters really run into that problem, if I recall.
I don't remember offhand right this minute.
I believe it only works if you draw your power from something like a god or nature, because where you're drawing your power source from is inherently alive and inherently aligned a certain way. Whereas magic itself, there is not for alignment.
I can't think of any instances where a sorcerer or wizard has to deal with that.
No, except I think in artifacts and some wondrous items, where I believe if your alignment doesn't match the item, it's magically enchanted against being used by opposing alignments for express purpose of usually to avoid being destroyed by an enemy agent, kind of a thing. As we mentioned, the secret language of the druids. Druids have their own special language that only druids know. I have never, ever in the history of playing this game run
Neither
into a
have I.
situation where that language comes into play in the slightest, because you never run into other druids. If you do
It's
run
they're
into other
rare.
druids, your druid usually ends up taking the forefront. It can very quickly turn the entire campaign into being just about them, and that is not fun. And that is why I never put druids in my campaigns if there's already a druid in the party. If the situation calls for a druid, only one druid is required to answer that call, in my opinion. It's either the party's druid or an NPC.
Druids do share many of the references for nature that the rangers and bards have, and have very much a familiarity with natural lands. Druids tend not to understand the urban mannerisms of the world around them because they don't stay in urban environments for very long at all, if ever.
Right.
So they don't really get rogues, and they tend to find arcane magic disruptive and slightly distasteful. So they don't get along all that well with the wizard and the sorcerer.
Right.
It's more of a dislike.
Yeah, it's more of a dislike other than a hatred. They will tolerate it, but they may not like it. Again, it runs into the same thing where clerics of opposing alignments, or just differing alignments in general, they may work together, but that doesn't mean they like each other.
They also tend not to like paladins.
No, they do
find
not
the
like
devotion to the abstract ideal instead of the real world absolutely stupid.
And
So,
as we'll get into probably next week, as I look at the time, paladins are stupid. So another feature of the druids, because druids do get a lot of features, is the woodland stride ability, which lets them move through undergrowth and other areas that would normally count as difficult terrain in the woodlands as if it was normal terrain. They can just ignore thorn bushes and things like that. I believe that magical manipulated vegetation still impedes them as normal, but natural vegetation cannot impede their movements whatsoever. They also gain trackless step, which allows them to move without leaving a trail constantly. You can never track a druid that has attained 3rd level. They leave no trace behind them. They're so at one with nature that nature just covers their tracks for them. At 4th
Unless they
level,
want to.
Yeah, unless they want to. 4th level, they gain a +4 bonus on saving throws against spell-like abilities of Fey origin because they can resist Fey creatures, which are creatures born of nature itself. Because they know of nature and they're devoted to nature, they can resist the darker lords of nature. So nature creatures that try and tempt them into doing something, the druid's like, I know how this works, I ain't falling for that trick. We went over wild shape pretty much as one can go over wild shape. You turn into an animal. There's really not much else you could say about it. One thing we should do before we wrap up, I think, because this is really the only other feature we only briefly touched on, is timeless body. You stop aging. You may think, well, that's an interesting fluff thing. Why do I care that I stop aging? Because there is a mechanics behind aging. At certain ages, dependent on your race, you will reach different levels of aging. Young adult, middle-aged, elder, venerable. And as you progress past adult, you run into the issue that your physical stats begin to deteriorate because your body is aging, and your mental stats begin to rise. For spellcasters, this isn't a big deal. They generally don't use their physical stats. For everyone else, this can be a detriment because this represents their reflexes slowing, their strength fading, their fighter edge is dulling.
Their health is getting worse.
Their health is getting worse. And what Timeless Body does is it locks you at the age mechanics-wise. If you're 30 years old when you become a level 15 druid, you will be 30 years old for all intents and purposes, including that of game mechanics, until the day you die. Which means you no longer gain penalties from aging because you have not physically aged. The only other class that does that, I believe, is the monk. That's why monks and druids have this ability. In the form of the druid, they become so at one with nature that nature preserves them until their time is up. In the case of the monk, I think monks just do it because they become so adept at becoming one with themselves and honing their own body that they just told their body, okay, now you stop aging. You stop this right the hell now, son of a bitch. As a listener, just pointed out, as I was about to say, on the other hand of the spectrum, you still gain the mental stat bonuses because you're still getting older, wiser, and smarter. You're just not slowing down physically anymore. So ideally, if you could become Timeless Body in your adult prime, you're in a very good situation. You're going to become smarter and wiser as you age, but you're not going to have your reflexes dulled. And that's one of the cool things you get at last level for a druid. And that's really all
Not at
there
last
is.
level. That's at 15th level.
15th level, sorry. I believe.
One last thing I'd like to talk about with druids is, who are druids? The elves and gnomes have an affinity for turning into druids.
Yes.
Humans and half-elves are also commonly druids. Dwarves, halflings, and half-orcs, you almost never see those as druids.
Right.
They really don't fit into the druid way of doing things. It's theoretically possible, but unlikely, especially for half.
Right. And one last thing before we wrap up, because we are going to be wrapping up here now. We went over a little bit barbarians, but for the sake of time, we kind of glanced over it with the other classes. I think we have just enough time to go over it. Fluff-wise, generally speaking, each class can be said to have a very common background to members of that class. For the barbarians, they're martial characters from the fringes of society or from tribal societies that aren't the accepted civilized society of the campaign setting. They could technically be just as civilized, if not more so, as the kingdom or the lands where your campaign takes place, but because they come from an outside land, they're viewed as barbarians. An example of this is in medieval Europe. If you're from the Middle East, or from Asia for that matter, you were considered a barbarian, even though you were just as advanced, if not more so, than Europe, who was stuck in the Dark Ages, while you were still actually acknowledging that science is a very important, useful thing. They kind of take away from the idea that you might be more advanced because of the whole illiterate thing. But if you're willing to spend the skill points, and frankly, you have nothing else to spend them on as a barbarian anyway, in my humble opinion, you can get rid of the illiterate factor and just start playing as a fully literate barbarian. And you could just be from a distant land, and the illiteracy could be more represented as you're just being unfamiliar with local languages. So that when you try and learn more local languages, you have to spend that extra bit of effort to learn it because you're from a strange land. Generally speaking, bards, the common source of bards is usually bardic colleges or mentors. Most bard characters come from these large universities and colleges that teach bardic songs and bardic magics, or from just wandering bards who pick up ragamuffins and orphans and just whoever wants to learn and teaches them the bard way. Clerics, very, very easy to figure out where clerics come from. If you follow a god, you probably got trained in a church. You're probably a priest who then got trained in martial ways and then was sent out to essentially spread your god's word. If you don't follow a god, the sky's the limit really on how your cleric came to gain its power. Because it's never really established, unless your game master specifically says so, that non-god clerics have a church. For the most part, they usually don't.
Can I interject here? There is
Certainly.
one big thing. Even non-god clerics should be trained. There is a completely different class for clerics that are not trained.
Yes.
Yeah.
Originally there wasn't, but eventually Wizards did decide that untrained clerics are a thing in their own class. So clerics have some form of training, be it from somebody else with similar ideals, some sort of a cabal or cult or something, or in a church of some sort. Druids, very simple. Druids trained by other druids. Whether it be individually or in a group is dependent on the druid in the area. Usually it's individually though. An old druid raises somebody in the druid tradition out in the middle of the woods, and then they die and pass on their druidy lands and holdings to their apprentice druid, who now takes over as the druid of those lands. You don't own those lands, you're just the caretaker of them of sorts. Because generally speaking, druids tend not to believe in the concept of owning land, because land is just around you. You can't own dirt. Dirt just exists. How can you own dirt? Everything uses dirt. And that's generally how druids are trained. There are some druids that may be trained in formal druidic groups, but that's generally more rare because, as we said, large groups of druids in general are very, very rare. More rare than single druids are. And that really wraps up classes for today. I was expecting to get a little further than we did, but that's still a decent way through. We're about halfway through the class list, I believe.
We could do fighter. It will only take 2 minutes.
No, I actually have a lot to say on fighter, and we're at our hour. I would like to thank everyone for watching. We will continue to do classes until we hit the end. So we'll hold off our session on races until we finish those. So after this one, you can expect us to pick up classes again at fighter. Hope you enjoyed, and I hope you tune in again. This has been the Bat, Fox, and Flux Tavern, and I myself say goodbye, and for my co-host, I also say goodbye. And
don't
hope
forget
you enjoy.
to support the Patreon.
Yeah, I was just about to say, and if you liked what you heard, don't forget to support our Patreon, patreon.com/Sovek. SovekOnivris. I have to actually pull up my own Patreon. I don't link it as often as I should do. /SovekOnivris.
God, you're horrible at plugging.
I am horrible at plugging. Well, I'm new at plugging. This is like really like the second or third time I've actually plugged myself, and this week. But yeah, so
last week you were plugging yourself all
I was
over the
plugging myself
place.
like crazy. I decided to take a little break this week to get everyone's ears a rest. But yeah, it's patreon.com/SovekOnivris. Your donations will certainly help toward whether or not we do more than 2 or 3 seasons of this at all. And obviously I have my own stream, twitch.com/SovekOnivris. Red Fox has his stream, twitch.com/RedFoxNightFox. Flux has his, twitch.com/Fluxin.
Wait, Twitch dot what? You wanna? You think of plugging even that, Sovek?
Twitch.tv.
Twitch.tv, not Twitch.com.
Well,
It took me a second to realize. Wait a second.
Even botching my plug. Come on.
I was thinking of
Botched
my
mine
YouTube.
too. There's an underscore in there.
I forgot there's the underscore. As I said yours, I was actually trying to remember what my YouTube was, because I was going to say I also have a YouTube where this will be uploaded, and you've probably found it if you're already listening to this.
Don't forget to do things.
Yeah. So from all of us here, once again, goodbye.